So what if the statutes say that the central bank is independent, if in fact what happens is that the finance minister or somebody rings up and says, don't you agree that it's about time for an interest rate cut? And then the central bank does it.
Hello, I'm Shackleton. I'm the Editorial and Research Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm also the editor of our journal, Economic Affairs, which has been for over 40 years now, publishing the best of comment on matters which are of interest to academics and to students of the discipline. And today I'm joined by Dr. James Forder, who is the Research Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs and is also a Fellow of Balliol College, Oxford. And we're going to talk about an article which James wrote recently for Economic Affairs entitled The Fallacies of Central Bank Independence. So that's quite a serious topic. Could you perhaps begin, James, by explaining to viewers what exactly we mean by central bank independence and how it can be measured?
How it can be measured, yes. Well, what we mean by it's in itself a difficult question. The idea of central bank independence came to great prominence in the 1980s and was very quickly accepted. And what was meant by the advocates of independence was apparently something like removing monetary policy from political or party political control, something like that. So it was, the central bank was to be an executive agency which would set policy. In most cases, it was said it would set policy with some objective determined by the government or possibly a constitutional determination, but it would do it without, as had been the case in many countries, the government instructing it about, for example, interest rate decisions. So that's the sense of it. In the implementation, it's rather more problematic because the question arises how one does make it be that the government...
Yeah, yes, you're quite sceptical, really, of measures which just look at the legal position of central banks.
Absolutely. It was a substantial part of the advocacy of the 1980s arose from people who were reading central bank laws, central bank statutes, and simply scoring them up. And if it said the central bank is independent, then, as it were, that would be one point. Exactly how it was done depended on the study. And if it said that the central bank appointed its own head from within the bank, then that was another point, and this sort of thing. And we could add up these points and determine how independent one central bank was as compared to another. I thought this was complete nonsense. Because that sort of statute reading approach gives no acknowledgement to anything with a resemblance to the political culture. So what if the statutes say that the central bank is independent, if in fact what happens is that the finance minister or somebody rings up and says, don't you agree that it's about time for an interest rate cut? And then the central bank does it. Or anything like that. How can you possibly tell? What we can be sure you can't tell is what the political culture is by reading the statutes. It could be that one could study the country and find out these things. So the pretense that, as the advocates made out, that they had evidence that independence would lower inflation by comparing different central banks measured in this way, and then showing that the inflation rate over long periods, a couple of decades or 3 decades, had been lower in the countries they scored up as more independent, I thought was a terrible piece of evidence and ignorant of political systems.
Yeah, could you perhaps just go back a little bit there and say why in the 1980s when central bank independence became popular, what were the sort of intellectual arguments for it? Was it simply an instrumental thing that if we do this, then there will be that, or was there some other story behind that?
Well, there were excuse me, there were intellectual arguments arising from economic theory. or possibly economic experience. I think, two pieces of theory were prominently advanced. One was a story to the effect that inflation couldn't bring any benefits. And this was alleged to be a new discovery of some sort, or newly accepted fact anyway, that whereas the 1960s had supposedly been, or early 1970s had been a period where policymakers had for some reason believed that a policy of inflation would lower unemployment, it had now been recognised that that wasn't true. And this feeds the case for independence, because it says there's only one thing that monetary policy might achieve, which is price stability. We no longer believe it can lower unemployment, and consequently there were no longer any difficult decisions about how much inflation or how much unemployment to target.
Now, this argument about there was no trade-off between inflation and unemployment was obviously, people will recall, was best put by Milton Friedman. But Milton Friedman was not an advocate of central bank independence, was he? It's one of the points you bring out in your paper.
Quite so. Well, Friedman was a prominent advocate of the no trade-off view, which, as far as I know, there is almost completely accepted, and importantly in my picture of this story, was already accepted in the 1960s. So Friedman has a prominent statement of it, but the idea that it was a discovery of the 60s or the 70s seems to me to be historically quite wrong. But indeed, as you say, before that, early in the 1960s, Friedman had written a paper on central bank independent, well, on the question of should the monetary policymaker be independent, and criticised it for its undemocratic aspects. He said, in the modern world of democracy, how can it possibly be something so important as this is not under democratic control? And for the danger, and he cited a number of examples from the preceding period in America, the danger that the central bank would in fact come under the influence of the banking sector. It would the central bank, which is not democratically controlled and is therefore labelled as independent in the sense that the elected government can't tell it what to do, supposedly, might nevertheless be institutionally prone to pursuing the interests of some section of society. And Friedman, thinking very much about the Federal Reserve, thought the banking sector was a likely one. So in fact, you'd have monetary policy set in the interest of the banking sector, and then protected from the democracy. And then just on good democratic grounds, Friedman thought that was a very bad idea.
Yeah, and it's about accountability as well, isn't it? That's the point which you've made, I think.
Right, quite so. This is right back to the beginning of the first question: what is independence and how do we measure it? Well, what is independence? Of course, one doesn't expect continuous votes on interest rates, for example. What does one expect? Well, an expert agency, which is in practical terms running things. That's what I would have thought what one would expect, but the democratic control of it would still be there, so that as I would say, the accountability for the policy rests with the politicians who oversee it, even though one doesn't expect the politicians to be taking an active role in the setting of monetary policy, any more than one expects them to be taking an active role in timetabling the BBC programmes. There's an agency which does it. And so accountability, I think this was greatly muddled up in some of the stories about independence, where it's been said, for example, that central bankers show up at congressional or parliamentary committees and answer questions about their policy, and this is their accountability. Well, no, it's not. One doesn't need to know much about democracy to realise that being allowed to ask people questions isn't what makes them accountable. What makes them accountable is when they can be fired for doing a bad job. And if the central banker can be fired for doing a bad job, then I don't think we'd say they're independent.
Now, in the UK, the Bank of England has a monetary policy committee, doesn't it, which is made up of great and good economists.
Right.
You've not been asked yourself, I assume, have you?
No, I'll keep quiet about that.
But you're quite scathing of this, actually, in your paper, aren't you? That economists like this because they think they might be favoured in this way.
Well, sure. I thought it was, in a sense, it was a public relations masterstroke. When it was decided that there would be a committee of policymakers, and excuse me again, the committee. One might have thought, well, of course, the committee will be a committee from inside the bank, to be in the perhaps natural way of thinking of it. But then somebody said, well, why don't we have academics on it as well? Ooh, well, show me the monetary economist who doesn't want to be a central banker. And it's terribly unfortunate, but really these sorts of conflicts of interest do exist. Now, does it help somebody become appointed to a central bank policy board if they've been critical of the idea of independence? Well, I doubt it. It has happened, but it hasn't happened much. And there's a wider group than that, because it's not only that there's the policy-making committees, but there's the gigantic and prestigious conferences run by independent central banks, a number of which have been about what a good idea independent central banking is. Now, would one like to be invited to these conferences? Would one like to be invited twice? Better watch what you say the first time if you would.
Yeah. Is the MPC unique in this respect, or do other central banks have similar committees?
Well, the committee structure is commonplace. I don't know whether there are anywhere it's truly as one person deciding it, because the composition of the committees will vary. And certainly in other places, academics have found their way on secondment from their universities sometimes. But I think the British case is a striking one because of the specificity with which there are appointed external members, very predominantly.
It's worth mentioning, of course, that the IEA runs and has run for many years a shadow monetary policy committee, which looks at the same evidence and tries to see whether there are differences which they'd like to emphasise. And of course, the members of the shadow monetary policy committee tend to be slightly different ideologically, perhaps, than the mainstream of monetary economists in this country. What lessons do you draw from the experience of the last 30, 40 years or so of this?
Well, there are lessons of a couple of sorts, aren't there? One is that the idea, which was another part of the case for central bank independence, there's really only one thing for monetary policy to do, and that's control inflation. And so long as we get that right, then at the very least, monetary policy has done everything that can be asked of it. And in some of the presentations, it seemed, and everything else is bound to go well, if only it does that. So like a magic ingredient. Well, I think we can say that turned out not to be correct, because inflation was well controlled, and then we had a financial crisis. And so we learn that the single-mindedness of the inflation targeting is a mistake, and we learn that that component of the case was central bank independence, which says you can afford to, you don't care about democracy because there's only one thing for it to do, and you can measure how well it does that. In fact, we now know that there definitely are trade-offs in monetary policy, not the artificial one between inflation and unemployment that people talked about, but other ones which come at us by surprise and need discretionary decision taking. So that's one kind of lesson on the background case for thinking of monetary policy in the way that promotes central bank independence. But there are other things as well. For example, consider the statute reading methodology that I was criticising earlier. We find in Ben Bernanke's recent book a discussion of what makes the central bank independent, commenting on the extent to which the independence of the Federal Reserve has varied at different times. And he actually says that Paul Volcker, the famous inflation-fighting central banker of the 1980s, was more independent because he had the support of Presidents Carter and Reagan. Now, that's a very hard statement to square with just as a matter of logic. If we measure independence by reading statutes, then the support of individual personalities cannot be part of the story. But also as a matter of common sense, if independence is about removing monetary policy from political control, then the idea that Ronald Reagan's support is something that enhances it. So there's that kind of lesson. There are lessons in economic theory, the idea of policy credibility, which was greatly advanced as a benefit of central bank independence, has been, I think, mostly ignored by central bankers. And certainly, again, in Bernanke, one cannot find the discussions of an attitude to policy making as it went on in his account of the policy making of the Federal Reserve in his time, which reflects the academic ideas of policy credibility.
Can we just talk a little bit about this credibility thesis? Because this relates to theoretical discussions, Kittle and Prescott and people like that, many years ago now. Right. Can you just talk us through that a little bit?
I can have a go. The original framing, well, the commonplace framing from early on concerned inflation and unemployment. And the proposition was that the labour market, anticipating inflation, will set high wages, and if they do that, then the policymakers in a difficult position because they must either cause inflation to validate these high wages or cause a recession by stabilising prices. Everything would work out better if the labour market could be induced to set low wage increases in the first place. And then the policymaker validates those by having low inflation. But the further proposition was that the simple idea that the policymaker might say, well, we'll have low inflation, will not induce the labour market to set low wage increases because, so it goes, arguing in game theory mode, if the labour market does set low wage increases, then the policymaker would have a kind of benefit, a temptation from causing inflation because that would temporarily lower unemployment. So since the policymaker is supposedly determined to lower unemployment, come what may, the labour market can never be induced to believe that they will set low inflation. So what is required is this magic ingredient called credibility, so that then when the policymaker says, we will set low inflation, the labour market believes them and they set low wages accordingly. And then, of course, the policymaker does set low inflation. So that's the application of the idea of credibility to the situation as perceived in the 1980s. Now, there's just a bit of wand waving. It said, well, you know, the independent central bank will have credibility. No real argument for that. And the Kittle and Prescott, whom you cite quite rightly, didn't say that. Their discussion of the problem that I've just described is all in terms of an entity called the policymaker. They plainly had the Federal Reserve in mind. The Federal Reserve was supposedly an independent central bank at the time. The credibility problem is not a problem of democracy. Nowhere in that story does it say the policymaker seeking votes will do something. It's very notable in Kittle and Prescott and Baron Gordon, which is a following on article. Nowhere is there an electoral motive. So you say, well, let's remove the electoral motive and the problem will be gone. Well, no, it won't.
Well, another idea floating around at that time was the idea of the political business cycle, wasn't it? That you know, facing an election, then you let the economy rip, and then you, after the election, you clamp down again. And that was all part of this idea of trying to get away from that cycle,
Sure.
wasn't it?
And that cycle would be a problem. And there's what you might say is a fussy academic point, that story is not the credibility story and isn't consistent with it once one gets into the details of the theory. But it is another argument. So as a matter of history, the case for independence was made substantially on the basis of credibility theory, not the political business. But of course, one could go back and reconstruct the story in the way you have. Well, I'm pretty doubtful about the political business cycle. There are cases which look like political business, so cases of governments acting before elections in economically damaging but apparently appealing ways to bring temporary benefits and win elections. So there are examples of them doing that. And then, as you say, clamping down after the election. There are amazingly few. Where there are some, they're often not with monetary policy anyway, because fiscal policy is the natural way to do this. Cut taxes before the election, if that's what you want to do, and then raise them straight after. As this happened in Britain in the 1950s, that's true. But there's another thought about it, which is one doesn't have to be an extremist about the rationality of people to think that voters might learn. And it might be possible to win a general election with an unsustainable tax cut in 1955, and it might be possible in 1959. But are we supposed to believe that election after election, we always have tax cuts before the election, and the voters always say, nobody bothers to point out that this is... So I think there's reason to doubt it there, but there's also reason to doubt the evidence. Because what I can quote the UK in 1955, that looks like a political business cycle, and the United States in 1972 is certainly describable as one. And Britain in 1983, that would be a difficult one, because here's a Prime Minister who says, we must stop inflation, right? And so here comes a recession, and we don't reverse it before the election. What we do is state a principled case that we believe we're doing the right thing, and we can explain why that is, and we can explain that it's painful and all that. And that's an electorally sellable proposition. And then what about Britain in 1992? It's the same thing. That was the year of the exchange rate mechanism. And John Major's surprise win, saying that the maintenance of the exchange rate and the high interest rates that went with it were essential to policy.
And then we saw what happened.
But he won, fighting on that hard-nosed story, and the devaluation came after the election. Now that really flies in the face of the political business cycle story, because on the theory that we do the slack expansionary things before the election, then they got it very badly wrong. They did it after the election. But anyway, they won doing the hard-nosed thing.
Okay, we're running out of time, but there is one question I meant to ask you, and this is about the idea of more than one objective for central banks. And in your paper, you discussed Mark Carney's work, amongst other things. Mark Carney was noted for his wanting to bring in net zero into the framework somehow. I mean, what do you think about that kind of story?
Well, I think that in the economics literature, of course, there were 2 points of view about this. There's one thought that in the most detailed, the most sophisticated, complex of mathematical models, it is probably true somewhere that if we were optimizing our environmental policy, monetary policy would be involved in that in some minute way. That in an enormously complex and, of course, undiscoverable economic model, every policy would probably be involved in pursuing every objective. And now, that's probably right in the mathematician sense, but it's completely contrary to common sense, because one cannot calibrate all these policies. So at the other extreme, we think of one policy, one target. And monetary policy targets inflation, and in my view, carbon taxes target carbon emissions. And these And of course, there's some impact of carbon taxes on the rate of inflation and that sort of thing, some impact of monetary policy on carbon emissions, but that's not the point. The point is to get straight policy making.
Yeah, so you go back to a kind of Tim Bergen type.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So in some cases, there'll be policies which need to be used with more than one objective, but the idea that monetary policy has such profound effects on environmental outcomes that it should be doing that seems to me to be very silly. But silly because we should be pursuing our environmental objectives with tools targeted to those objectives. But there's a further point, which is about the accountability of the central bank. It seems to me that accountability is anyway tenuous, but the story about accountability is they're independent, they're protected from democratic control, they have a lot of prestige, all this, but we can at least assess them clearly because they have only one thing to do. They don't get to make excuses that they failed in their main mission because they were so clever about their secondary mission. So the proliferation of objectives clouds that picture as well. And it's all too easy to imagine future central bankers saying, well, yes, of course, the inflation unfortunately has got out of control, but there you are, we were minimising road traffic deaths and reducing carbon. And the more that one piles on, and that's all very well if there's democratic control. If we can say the voter, as it were, can make an overall assessment and say, well, all in, as we do with the government at a general election, all in, we like what you did, or we don't like what you did.
So we don't elect central bankers.
Exactly. So the independent, it seems to me if you're going to be serious about independence and slightly serious about accountability, then the way you get to be slightly serious is by saying there's one objective and we can judge them on their performance in that. And this, of course, is a sort of Friedman point in a way. It's if we don't, the accountability of them is what protects us against them pursuing sectional interests, for example. And that is greatly clouded by the proliferation of objectives, and which was precisely the reason in the first place that the advocates of independence, the advocacy of independence took off because the story was told that the monetary policy only affected one thing. Now that's not true because, as we know from financial crises and that sort of thing, it affects more than one thing. But they were right, at least, to think that all the while there is only one objective. That's relevant to the accountability question.
Well, thank you very much, James.
Thank you.
This is a very interesting topic, and if you want to follow this up, on the material at the bottom of this YouTube, we have details of a link to the original article which James wrote. So do follow that up. And also, if you want to subscribe to Economic Affairs, there is also a link there to the Wiley website which enables you to do this. So thank you very much, James.
Thank you.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.